Okay, good morning, everybody. So this morning we have Catalina, who is going to present her work on accelerating graph applications using phase transactional memory. So this work should be presented in 2 weeks, I guess, in Europar. So this will also serve as a rehearse for Catalina. So we are going to ask some questions after her presentation. So Catalina, if you are ready, you can start now. Thank you.
Okay, sir. So hi, my name is Catalina. I'm going to present this paper called Accelerating Graph Applications Using Phase Transactional Memory. As Professor said, it will be presented in the Europar conference in September. So this presentation I will carry as follows. First, I'm going to show you an introduction of the topics that we require to understand our approach. Then I'm going to show you a little motivation example, and I will tell you why we think this is an interesting line of research. Then I'm going to explain our approach, which we call graph-oriented phased transactional memory. And then I'm going to show you some of our experimental results, and then I will conclude the presentation. So first, graphs, they are data structures that can model complex relationships between data points being the vertices of the graph, and the relationships being the edges of the graph. So because they are used in many areas, like networking and biology and others, they are becoming larger and larger and continually growing. So they require specific programming models to write programs, specifically parallel programs. So an example of a programming model for graph processing is the vertex-centric model, which basically motivates the programmer to think like a vertex and operate a single vertex at a time, right? And to use the edges as incoming or outgoing messages to the neighboring area. So because the idea is to operate several vertices at a time, there is potential conflict that can occur within the neighboring area of each vertex. So because I can't predict in which order the vertices are going to be processed, I have some irregular behavior that I need to be able to handle optimally. So for the particular case of shared memory architectures, our proposal is to use transactional memory. So transactional memory, as you know, or not, is an unblocking concurrency control mechanism. And the idea of TM is basically to facilitate software development for the programmer. So what the user or the programmer has to do is basically enclose the parallel region within two statements, a beginning and an end. And what the runtime, with the transactional memory runtime does is to keep a control and a log of the read set and the write set, and to compare with this log with the other concurrent transactions. And so if two transactions that are being executed in parallel are conflicting, so I have to abort at least one of those transactions. But if there is no conflict, then I can commit that transaction. So what the runtime does is to ensure that the transactions satisfy the atomicity, isolation, and consistency properties. So there are mainly two types of TM implementations. We have the hardware implementation, which is embedded in the architecture, and we have the software implementation, which is basically a software runtime, and then they both have their drawbacks. For instance, the hardware TM implementation is very fast, but it shows a local storage limitation, because it is limited to a cache level, to the first or second cache level, it depends. So there is a limitation in hardware TM, but there is also a limitation in software TM, because it is kept all in software, this logging and control. There is an overhead related to it. So the proposed is to, or our approach is basically a phase TM implementation, which combines these two modes of operation with an additional operation mode, hardware, software, and global locking. And the motivation for us using transactional memory is because of the fact that for each vertex, the neighboring area of operation can vary considerably. There are different sizes of the neighborhood of each vertex. So this demands different speculative storage sizes. So this is our motivation, the main reason why we think both software and hardware transactional memory implementations can be used in graph processing. To show you an example of this, I have here a pseudocode of a very typical implementation application of the single source shortest path. This application is written here using a vertex-centric. And it goes as follows. First, I have to keep, because it is data-driven, I have to keep a work list of all of the vertices I'm going to process. So in single source shortest path, I begin with the source vertex, right? And so I grab the vertex from the work list, and I'm going to execute the shortest path function for every vertex I grab from the work list. So what I do is grab the vertex, and then I'm going to iterate over all of the neighborhood of the vertex, and update the weights, the path weights of all of the vertices in the neighborhood. So every time I update a value or a vertex, I push this vertex into a work list, and then another thread is going to begin a transaction by grabbing that vertex from the work list and executing the same function. So that is a way to propagate the message of the shortest path through all of the graph. So for this example, for this particular example, we have our approach, which we call GoTM, and we compare it with Galois locking mechanism. Galois is a C++ library, which is state-of-the-art, very well known for writing parallel graph applications, in general terms, irregular applications. So it has all these constructs and functions to facilitate that for the programmer. So we compare Galois locking mechanism with ours. Ours is the red one, and we execute with different workloads with different degrees. Now remember that the degree of a vertex is the number of incoming or outgoing edges, right? So we test for different average degrees of the graph, and we find that for a lot of the cases, we have at least some kind of improvement over Galois. This speed up is normalized with the sequential execution as the baseline. Now to explain our approach, as I mentioned, graph-oriented TM, we have three modes of operation. We have hardware mode, software mode, and global lock. To decide in which mode of execution I'm going to be executing the transactions, because in HTM I can only execute the transactions in a single mode, so I have to decide when to switch from mode to mode. So we keep two measurements that we take every window sampling. We keep a measure of the commit throughput. This is the number of transactions that committed in the same mode of operation during this window sample. And we also keep a measure of the number of cycles that it takes to execute a transaction. This measurement is mainly a proxy to the size of the transaction, because we know that, at least in hardware mode, we have a restriction in that regard. So to decide when to take this transition 8 from hardware mode to software mode, I compare if the commit throughput in hardware mode is lower than it was in the latest measurement in software mode, or if the number of cycles it takes to this is an average it takes to execute a transaction is higher than a certain threshold that we decide experimentally, then we can begin to issue transition 8 and start execution in software mode. Now, while executing in software mode, I also keep the measurements of the parameters I mentioned to be able to compare. And we also have to keep the count of the deferred transactions. These transactions are the ones that, while executing in hardware mode, were unable to commit because of capacity limitations, and were the ones that issued that caused the transition to software mode. So we know that these transactions must be executed in software mode before we even consider another transition from software to hardware, which would be transition B, right? So in this case, while in software mode, I compare if commit throughput in software mode is lower than it is in hardware mode, then or if the number of cycles it takes to execute a transaction it goes below a threshold, again chosen experimentally, then we can issue transition B, because we know that it is probably better executing in hardware mode. Finally, the third execution mode, it's sequential execution. This is particularly for the transactions that have or show persistent conflict. So what it happens is, if I'm executing in hardware mode and there is a transaction that keeps aborting because of conflict, and after a number of retries it cannot commit, then I issue transition C, right, to global lock, and that transaction grabs a global lock, takes a global lock, and performs a sequential execution. And once this transaction sequentially executes and it's done, then I immediately issue transition D back to hardware mode. So that explains our approach, which is, as you see, a phased TM implementation with a certain parameter that helps us decide in which mode of operation we are required to execute for performance improvement. And we test our approach with 7 applications, all known applications for graph processing: single source, shortest path, breadth first, spanning tree, page sort, betweenness centrality, page rank, and connected components. And for the workloads, we randomly generate 3 of them, the first 3, to be able to compare with different average degrees in different sizes These workloads follow a power law distribution, which means I have some of the vertices of the graph have very high degree, but most of them do not have very small degree. So we have a varying range of degrees in the graph, and the other two are workloads that you can find in the SNAP dataset. These graphs, they are social networks. They are from social networks and have different sizes. This is by far the largest of our workloads. It has 2 billion edges, which is high, very high. And so these are some of our results. We compare, as I mentioned earlier, our approach, which is the red one, with Galois locking mechanism, which is the blue one, and we also compare with phased TM implementation, which is the best runtime you can find in of transactional memory, which is called HTM star, right? So these results are for the shortest path, breadth first search, and weakly connected components, and these are our best results. You can see that for all of the cases, in all of the workloads, our approach shows the best performance. We see that the green one, which is PHTM star, doesn't scale beyond 8 threads of execution. And we see that Galois does scale, but it is mainly outperformed by our approach. But we also have bad results. And this is for the PageRank application. What happens with this application is that it has very large transactions. So the runtime is or the application is unable to leverage hardware TM, which is the fastest, and beyond 5%, it doesn't use more than 5% of in the execution. So we see that particularly for this the largest of our workloads, results are good even with Galois, but Galois does scale for most of the cases, unlike PHTM star, which doesn't really work. And so those are our results. To conclude, this paper presents our approach, which is, as I said, a phased transactional memory implementation, particularly for vertex-centric programs, but is not restricted to it. I can also use other types of programming models, subgraph-centric or edge-centric, and just enclose the parallel region within the statements of a transaction. But we do test 6 of our tests are vertex-centric. And so our experimental results show that the speed up is between 2 times and 7 times for some of our workloads. And that's it. This work is funded by the FAPESP and the CCES Research Center, and that's it.
Okay, thank you, Catalina. So it took you about 20 minutes, just to know about it.
Okay.
Okay, so now we're going to ask you some questions. So does anybody have some questions for Catalina? I have some questions, but I would like somebody else's to ask first, because I'm also an author of the paper, so it's not very fair. So if somebody has a question, please ask her.
Hi, Catalina. Could you come back to the last result you show?
The last,
This one. Could you explain here? I'm seeing this like your results are really bad. Is this what I should see?
Our approach is bad. Yes.
Okay.
And it's bad because mainly because the runtime, because this PageRank application has very large transactions. It is unable to use hardware TM as much as it can. So we know that one of the drawbacks of software transactional memory is that it doesn't scale very well. There is an overhead. So for our case, for this particular case in PageRank, our results are not good.
Okay. But is there something you could do to mitigate these problems?
Oh, so many things. We were trying one thing, which is you know, in the transactional region, you have not only shared variables. You also have local variables, and you have variables that do not present conflict because they are read-only or things like that. So you should be able. There is a mechanism to avoid logging these kind of variables that you know are not required for conflict detection, because you know they do not present any conflict. So this is one of the things that we could try for this particular application, because the graph, the only region of conflict would be the graph itself, the topology of the graph. So the other variables should be able to avoid for logging. This would make software TM better, and it's actually a work for some other colleagues, and it's something we're trying to implement here too.
Okay, thank you, Catalina.
Okay.
Hi, Catalina.
Oh, sorry, Sandra, go ahead.
Thanks, Alexandro. Congratulations for the work. Let me see if I got it right, this last strategy that you described. So it's like you are trying to decrease the size of the transaction so you can enable the hardware mechanism to take part in the processing, right? Is that so?
I'm not sure if I understood correctly, but the idea is to make the software of the thing I just explained. The idea is to make software a little better, not to just go to hardware, because in hardware you cannot control the logging, and it is embedded in the architecture. But we could try to make software TM better.
Okay,
or more competent.
to make the software training provide better performance by by reducing the number of variables that you are taking care of. Is that so?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Sandra. Catalina, just so you presented some results that are very good.
Yes.
The earlier slide, but this one is very bad, right? So
Yeah.
one question that comes to mind is the following. So imagine I'm constructing a new application, and I don't know beforehand if my application is going to perform well with your approach or not. So is there some heuristics that I can use? Because if I know it's going to be bad, I would opt for Galois, right? So is there something I can use to decide if I should use GoTM or Galois before executing my application? Because you mentioned that the problem with PageRank is that the transactions are very large, right? Is that something I can use? So I could do some kind of experiments beforehand. And if I notice that my transactions are very large, very long, then I probably should opt for Galois. Is that something I could use?
Well, this is an intuition of mine. The size of the transaction, I do not measure specifically. You know that. So I cannot tell you specifically for which sizes our approach is going to work best, and in which cases Galois is going to work better. But you do know that because there is also one thing here in graph processing, and specifically in data-driven applications, as I decrease the number of the number of propagations I perform, the size of the transaction becomes shorter and shorter. So there is going to be some point in which I'm actually going to be able to use hardware transactional memory. The problem here is I do have a kind of a rough number. If I'm not able to, as this implementation is, if I'm not able to execute at least 45% of the time in hardware, then I'm not going to have, I'm not going to at least outperform Galois. Galois is very good. So it is a high bar, is what they call it. Yes. So yeah, I guess that's it. I mean, I can't tell for a specific portion. If I'm not able to at least 45% of the time to executing hardware, then I'm probably not going to outperform Galois.
So what about also adding Galois into that automaton? You know, like if you discover at runtime that either software or hardware or both are doing bad, you just somewhat magically go to Galois, you know.
So like something like a fourth execution mode.
Yeah. Galois would be another execution mode. It's just something that
it could happen.
Is that possible to do? You know, adding another node, and if something happens, like if you somehow discover at runtime that both hardware and software are doing bad, you go to Galois. But then you have to decide. Then we have to decide when to go back, right, to software hard. So that doesn't look very easy to do.
But also, there is a restriction in Galois locking mechanism that I have to. The transaction has to be written in a certain way, because the locking mechanism, what it does is to beforehand I take logs of my neighboring area, and then I can perform I can execute the function. So this generates a restriction in the way the transaction is written. In our approach, I can write the transaction in any way I want. I know the runtime is going to handle a conflict for me. So there would be that restriction if I add a fourth execution mode.
Okay, thank you. Somebody else?
Yeah, I have a question.
Hi.
Hello, Catalina. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for your presentation. It's a nice one. Okay. I have a question just for the regarding this current slide you are showing right now about your infrastructure that you made. That in your system you have 3 mode: hardware mode, software mode, GLOCK mode. So
yeah.
So I have first question is, does you in your presentation you explained that you are switching from hardware mode to software mode to hardware mode according to some based on some constraint. You decide you are measuring some throughput. You said in your previous slide maybe. So my question is, all these things you are measuring hardware throughput, software throughput. I mean, all these switchings, all these are happening during runtime, right?
Yeah.
So I was. That's my question. That is it not affecting your overall runtime? Is it not as you are just switching from here and there? Because I'm not so much familiar of this, but I was thinking that the traditional one that you are showed, the Galois lock, maybe Galois, that one, that one is actually software mode implementation, right?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so that's why my question is that that is only operating on software, but in your system you are switching from hardware to software, software to hardware, then GLOCK mode, is it not affecting your overall runtime? I mean, how actually you are reducing, how you are actually optimizing this thing in your system?
Well, I believe that that is one of the issues that you find it, for example, in the performance of PHTM star, which is a generic, right? It's a generic TM phase TM implementation. Our approach does to answer your question, your first question, yes, there is an overhead from the whole of all of the transitioning. Yes, that generates an overhead. That's something that should be minimized. But what we do here is using these parameters, these measurements we take. We try to optimize the number of transitions we make and the time it spends in each execution mode, just to avoid that kind of overhead. And I think that is mainly why our approach performs better than PHTM star.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Did you ever evaluate this overhead in particular of switching from one mode to the other, or because what your answer to Lisa is like it looked like your intuition, but did you ever check how much time you spend in those transition?
Well, this is theoretically a known fact that the number of transitions do generate an overhead, because every time I make a transition, I have to abort the executing transactions and then perform. But I do not have a specific number for that measurement. No, it is also not an intuition per se. This is something that it is known for this type of systems.
Catalina, I think you have measured some, at least the transition numbers, right? How frequently they happen. Because one of the things you want to avoid is that the system keeps switching, right, between software and hardware all the time. So these heuristics are optimized to avoid that kind of thing, because that's very true. If you waste most of your time just switching from one model to another, then it's gonna suck, right? But that's not what's happening here, actually.
And we also restrict that by keeping a sampling window, which I can also, it's also a parameter that is fixed, that we choose experimentally, but this window of execution limits the execution in a single mode for at least a portion of the time, just to avoid that kind of going back and forth.
Okay, great. More questions? Marcio, would you like to ask some questions?
No. Just
I just point you out because you have some.
Okay, but just congratulations, Catalina.
Well, thank you.
Any questions for Catalina? Gustavo?
No. That was a great work, Catalina. Congratulations. A very, very nice presentation.
Well, I'm glad you like it.
Okay. So if there's not any question, I think we are done here. Right. Guido, are you online? Are you hearing us? Because I think you are, you don't have voice, right? So anything else I should do here? Because it's my first time. I don't know exactly how this
works. Yes, we should
congratulate
Catalina. Yes. Yeah.
So there's nothing more after that, right? Okay.
Yeah. Okay, now we clap.
Okay. Okay, so let's clap. Yeah. Thank you, Catalina. Later on, I would like to add some specifics to your presentation, but we can discuss that later. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.